just go. Okay. And you're gonna edit this, right?
Yeah.
So we'll edit this. If I look weird, please edit it. My name is Danielle Nunez. I am currently a senior at the University of Washington, and this is my story. So my family, immigrant Filipino family, both of my parents were immigrants to Saipan, which is a Pacific island about 30 minutes away from Guam, which is where I grew up. So my mom is from the Bulacan province in the Philippines. So she's from like a very rural area, the rice fields and all of that. And my dad is from Pasay City, which is around the Manila area. So they met in Saipan as OFWs, overseas Filipino workers who were working in the hotel industry. My dad, I believe, started out as like a dishwasher, and my mom was a waitress in one of the restaurants, and they met there, fell in love, obviously got married, had my sister and I, and then right after they had me, we moved back to the Philippines where we lived for 5 years, until I was 5 years old in the Bulacan province where my mom is from. And then when I was 5, we moved to Saipan for like a year, and then we moved to Guam. So I grew up in Guam until I was about 18 years old. I left to come to the University of Washington. We grew up in Guam, which was a U.S. territory, but in the summers we would go back home to the Philippines, which is why I say like I grew up in both Guam and in the Philippines, because I would spend all my summers there, and that was like 3 to 4 months at a time. So I think my upbringing was pretty unique in that year-round during the school year I'd be, going to an American elementary school, middle school, high school, whatever, surrounded by Pacific Islanders speaking English in the classroom, and then I would go home to the Philippines for the summer, and I would be speaking Tagalog with my cousins who didn't know how to speak English, and we were in the rice fields in the province. So it was two very stark differences between where I lived year round and where I went for the summer, and I think that was really hard for me to grasp growing up, because I went through phases where in elementary school and middle school I just hated going to the Philippines. I would tell my mom things like, I don't want to go back there, like it's so dirty, it's so smelly, our family there is so poor. It was basically me as like a privileged Filipino American telling her that I didn't like going back home because our family was really poor there, and I thought that it was stinky and that it was dirty, and I just saw no value in going home. So I was being a brat basically. And then I think it was around like middle school, like the end of middle school, when I went back home one summer, and I don't know, I guess something changed. I think I got really close to like our extended family there, my cousins and like my grandparents. I think I started realizing why my mom was the only one out of her entire family who lived in America. Our entire family at that point was still back there. And I think it made me realize how privileged I was compared to my cousins, because they didn't know how to speak English. They grew up like by the rice fields, and just their lives looked completely different from mine. And I think that it was almost like a light turned on in my head, and I realized like, oh, like I should be lucky that I am growing up in Guam. And I also think that when I got older and I got really close to my extended family, I realized that they were some of the happiest, kindest people I had ever met, and I didn't see that as much around the people that I knew in Guam, and it kind of made me question like, oh, like these people back home, like they have nothing, but they're so happy, and I started to fall in love with the Philippines and just realize like how unique and privileged I was to be in both spaces at any given time, but also just recognizing that yes, I could go home to the Philippines and run around in the province and have fun with my cousins, like doing really simple things. Like I remember growing up, we would like do very provincial Filipino kid things, like we would catch like frogs in the field, or like things that American kids don't do at all. Just those simple things made me really, really happy. And then I would go back to Guam and like play like my Game Boy or whatever, and it just wouldn't make me as happy. So slowly I realized that privilege didn't necessarily translate into happiness, and for me it felt like the opposite growing up. So the more I got closer to my cousins, the more I just fell in love with my extended family back there and the experience there. So that when I got to high school, it was all about like, oh, I love the Philippines, I want to live there. And I would tell my parents, like, when I get older, I want to be rich enough so I can go back to the Philippines. And they would laugh at me. They'd tell me like, oh, like, why would you do that? Like, that's going backwards, you know, because we left for a reason and we're here for a reason, which is to have a better life. So yeah, I mean, my upbringing was a lot of struggling with hating the Philippines as a child, and then it growing on me the closer I got to my extended family and just recognizing how important that place was. And that's also when I started falling in love with like my culture as a Filipino. In high school, that's when I started my phase of like obsession basically with Filipino history and culture. I started to read like Jose Rizal and all of these Filipino authors. And this is like 16-year-old me, like as an American like girl, like going at an all girls like private Catholic high school, and there was a part of me that was like obsessed with trying to figure out like who I was and what my culture was, because I just didn't like, I feel like that was my way of coping with puberty. I feel like there are American kids who just like lash out at their parents, and I also did that, but at the same time I also wanted to find out who I was and why it was that I had to grow up away from my family that I loved so much back home. And I think I also got really close to like my grandpa. So he was like a very like prominent like political figure back home in our like province in the Philippines. So we were super close, like my cousins and I. And our grandpa was like the patriarch of the family, like he kept us together. And I think it was when I was 16 years old in high school. It was April 4, 2011. I got home from school and my aunt called me, and she sounded really weird. She just sounded really serious. And I answered the phone and I was talking to her. I was like, hey, like, Tita Raquel, like, how are you doing? And talking to her in Tagalog and everything. And she was like, oh, like, can you just give the phone to your mom? And I was like, oh, like, she doesn't want to talk to me. That's weird. So I gave the phone to my mom. And then my mom and her started talking. Then my mom put down the phone and she looked at me and she was like about to cry. And she was like, oh, like, wala na si tatay, and in Filipino that means like, oh, like, or in English that means, oh, like, tatay is gone. And I looked at her and I was like, what? You know, like, it didn't hit me because it didn't feel real. And then she told me that basically what happened is my grandpa was like assassinated right in front of our like province, like municipal court or like political center. So at that point I was just like, I didn't know what to think for a good 5 seconds, and then I just started like bawling. Like my mom started bawling. So it was, when I remember it very distinctly, like it was in my room in Guam and I was bawling on one corner and my mom was bawling on the other side, and that went on for like a good hour because I just didn't know what to think. Because this was like my grandpa who I was super close to. Like you know, he took care of me and my cousins, and like whenever I'd go home he'd buy us Jollibee, and like he was like the greatest, you know, Filipino like lolo that I could ask for. And it just didn't hit me, like it didn't feel real when that happened, because I didn't even know that politically that he was going through a lot of things. So for that to happen out of nowhere just really stunned our family, and we didn't know what to do. So I think we all banded together and we went home to the Philippines obviously immediately, and that was like right around the time of my final exams in my junior year. So it was a lot for me to kind of skip everything and just put everything on hold and go to the Philippines. So we did that. I remember going home and the family dynamic was just completely different because it felt like we lost the one person who kept us all together. And my mom being the oldest, the oldest kid, which is why she went to Saipan, was because she was the oldest in the family, so she was the one who kind of had to provide for everyone. She ended up taking like the role that my grandpa left as like the leader of the family, because now it was her obligation to make sure that my grandma was doing okay, that she was gonna be fine given what had just happened to my grandpa. And I think my cousins and I, we were all like in high school or in middle school, spread apart in those ages. We just didn't really know what to do or how to grapple with that. And I'm the type of person where in general I just don't process my emotions very well. It takes me a while to process it, so I don't feel it as it's happening. It's like a few weeks or months or even years later is when it starts hitting me. So when I went home for my grandpa's funeral, after that initial bawling session that my mom and I had in our room, after that, when we went home to the Philippines, I didn't cry once. My grandpa's funeral, we had the funeral procession in our entire province was there. There were hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, because my grandpa was a really well-known political figure in our area. That entire time, I didn't cry. When I said bye to him, when they were putting the casket down, I didn't cry. When we went back to Guam, I didn't cry. I think it was around when I got to college, when I started processing things. But I think that was really hard for me. Again, I was already obsessed with finding out who I was through Filipino culture and through my identity as a Filipino, and what happened to my grandpa made that fire even bigger, because I started wondering, why did this happen to him? And I started tracing it back to the root of, well, why did this happen? Why are we in poverty? Or why did my mom have to leave the Philippines? So it's all these questions started coming up in my head, and I just couldn't push it away. And then it became even harder a year later when my grandma, who again was heartbroken after what had happened to my grandpa, she died from cancer almost exactly a year and 1 month later. And I think it's because, honestly, when I think about it, I think her cancer came back because of a broken heart, and because she was so depressed after what had happened to my grandpa. So we went back home again for another funeral again, and this time it was even worse, because it was now we really don't have a patriarch or a matriarch, people who had originally led our family. So now my mom was really the person who had to step up as the oldest and take care of her 4 siblings and their entire family. So that was a lot, and it was just, when I think about high school, those were the 2 events that really shaped it. So that happened my senior year. Was it my no? Okay, my grandpa's death happened my sophomore year, and my grandma's happened my junior year. So when it was around that time, after we got back from my grandma's funeral and everything, we were back home in Guam, and that was around the time when everyone was thinking about what colleges they wanted to go to, and what they wanted to do after high school. And I was set on leaving Guam. I was just done being in. I felt sheltered in that tiny island environment. Now I love Guam, but at the time I really hated it. I wanted to get out, and I just didn't think that the things that I wanted to do in the world I could find in Guam. I wanted to leave and get that perspective, and I was set on it. And I told my parents that, and I think they kind of just laughed it off, and they were like, "Oh, that's a great idea. You should do that. We'll see what happens." And then senior year, when I got accepted to UW and a bunch of other schools, I showed it to them and I said, "Hey, I got in. I want to leave." And my parents, not just my parents, but everyone that I knew in Guam was against it. They were all automatically "No, that's a terrible idea. You're not going to leave. It's going to cost so much money for you to do that. You're going to throw your life away. You're going to get into so much debt." And I was furious that they didn't believe. I felt like they didn't believe in me, because they told me, "Yes, you can apply." And then when I told them I got in, it's almost as if they were surprised that I even got in the first place, because I was always the underachiever in high school. I didn't take anything seriously. When I decided to go to UW, it turned into, 1, me getting an education, but 2, me wanting to prove people wrong and show them that I wanted to do this because I thought that it was the right decision, and that I knew deep down that it was going to be the best decision that I was ever going to make, and that it was going to be an investment into my future. So I got into a lot of fights with my parents and just the people who were all really close and important to me. No one thought that it was a good idea for me to go to UW, but I was set on it. I'm a very stubborn person. So I got my mom to agree, because she felt bad for me. So it was literally May 1st when you're supposed to send in your commitment letter or whatever to UW and send in your new student and enrollment fee. So we were literally cutting it close, and I was sobbing to my mom, and I said, "If you don't send me there, I don't think I will ever forgive you." And I think that really turned something in her head, and she was like, "Oh, she's really serious about this." So my mom felt bad, and she said, "Okay, I'll pay the fee. I can't guarantee that you're gonna go there, but I'll pay the fee, and we just won't tell your dad for now." So we paid the fee, and booked my flight to freshman orientation, and throughout this entire time we didn't tell my dad because we knew he'd be against it. So I think about like a month before I had to leave, we told my dad, like, hey, like, she's actually leaving and you're not going to see her for like a good while. And I think that took him out of nowhere because he was really surprised. And again, he was against it. He was furious. But I said, look, like, you may not understand it now, but this is going to be the best decision I'm ever going to make. And this is going to change my life. And this is going to be worth it. Whether or not you believe in me, I'm going to do it. So I came to UW. My mom dropped me off. And when I came here, I felt like, well, it wasn't just, I felt like I knew that every single person I had cared about back home did not believe in me. I felt like I'd cut everyone off, and I'd basically left everything and everyone I'd ever known to come here. And I cut off so many relationships back home because so many people didn't believe in me. So the minute I stepped foot on UW's campus, which again was the first time I'd ever been to continental America, I'd never been here before. So it was a huge transition for me, and it was just a lot. I'd never been to the States before. No one back home believed in me. They didn't want me to be here. It was a completely new chapter for me, and I wanted to make sure that I would make the most of it because I knew that I was about to get myself into tens of thousands of dollars in debt as an out-of-state student. I knew that my parents didn't believe in me, and just the people I cared about thought that this was a bad idea. All of those culminated into me telling myself, like, this is the first decision that I, as a person, have ever made alone, and I'm going to make sure that it counts. And I'm going to make sure that when I get out of UW, I will be able to pay this debt. I just need to make the most of it. So I was very determined when I came to UW. Like, even before I got here, when I committed, I had already looked up UW Filipino Club. I looked up internships. Like, I was just that person. I'd spend hours on my laptop trying to plan my entire freshman year so that I would make the most of it because I wanted to prove people wrong, especially my parents, especially my very traditional conservative Filipino family who didn't believe in taking out loans to go to get an education, which is valid because, they don't have that back home. Loans aren't a thing there. So again, I came to UW with that very determined, intentional mindset of, I'm going to make it here. I don't know how, but I have no option to fail, so I'm going to have to. So I came to UW very determined to succeed because there's no other option. I didn't have the privilege of failing because even before I came here, in a sense, I had already failed because I had garnered about tens of thousands of dollars in debt. No one back home believed in me. So when I came here, I went to the first FOSSA meeting in my freshman year. It was the fall general meeting, and it was at the Ethnic Cultural Theater. And I remember they did like a skit about Harry Potter, but they related it to Filipino culture. And I just thought it was really funny and interesting, and also really eye-opening that there were Filipinos who were talking about like lumpia and adobo, like smack in the middle of America, because again, it was my first time in the States, so I had no idea what to expect. And I felt like my freshman orientation, I didn't see any Filipinos. So when I went to the first FOSSA meeting, I was like, oh, like they're all here, like there are Filipinos at UW, and that just made me feel a lot better. But at the same time, it was hard for me. Like, I did go to that first meeting, and I don't think I went to a few FOSSA meetings after that. I didn't come back until winter quarter, and one of the reasons why was just because it felt cliquey to me. I felt like everyone knew each other, and all these people were from Washington, and they were making all these like jokes about like, oh, like she went to this high school, or like she's from the North End, South End. And I was like, I don't know what any of that means, like I'm not from here. I'm not even from this continent. So it was just a lot, I think, for me to process. And I also just felt, I think this was when I started feeling the clash of, am I Filipino or am I Filipino American? Because at the same time, I was also taking third Andreessen's Asian American Studies 360 class, which is Filipino American Histories. And that just, again, that all happened my fall quarter of freshman year, and I just felt like my life and my identity was turned upside down, because in that one quarter with third, I had learned all about colonial mentality and Filipino American history and all these things about colonization that I had never before seen or heard in my entire life. And when I took that class, that was when I felt like this is my awakening, like this is a new chapter in my life, because all those questions that I talked about growing up and what had happened to my grandparents when I was asking, like why did my mom have to leave the Philippines to go and be an OFW? Why couldn't she just stay back home? Or why did that happen to my grandpa? Why are we in so much poverty back home? All of those questions started getting answered when I took thirds class, and he tied everything back to colonialism and imperialism, and it was like finally all the questions that I've been asking myself growing up were starting to get answered, and I latched onto that. And that's also when I think my passion for social justice and activism really started bubbling, because I started recognizing all of the injustices that I had grown up with. I started putting labels and names and answers to them, like, oh, this is because of colonialism, this is because of racism, this is because of white supremacy, and I had never recognized those things growing up because I just didn't learn about them. And also just growing up in Guam when I was surrounded by, brown folks, I had never really experienced racism until I came to UW. And for the first time, I was in the minority. I wasn't surrounded by Filipinos and Chamorros anymore. I was just one brown person in like a lecture hall of like 500 white people. And I think that was a lot for me to deal with, all in that fall quarter. So it all happened at the beginning of my freshman year, and it was just a lot for me. So I think most of my first year here was spent trying to grapple with that. And FOSSA came back in again, my winter quarter, after I'd taken thirds class, and I thought, you know what, like, maybe FOSSA just seems cliquey to me because I'm not trying hard enough. Like, I also need to take some initiative and, meet people and invest in this organization, because I could sense that there was a lot of value here and that this could really be my community in this huge school. So I started going to more meetings, getting more involved, and finding like my group of people that I was close to, I guess, in FOSSA. And slowly I just fell in love with the organization, and it became my community. So the end of my freshman year, I decided to run for political chair because I knew that this was the community that I wanted to invest my time in, and they had taken me in as a freshman, and just, I didn't know anyone, they didn't know me, but they were willing to take me in and mentor me. And officers at the time, like Mark Bello, he really sat me down and talked to me about being a Filipino American leader and what that means, and that just really inspired me. Again, because just coming from Guam, I felt like no one believed in me and no one thought that it was a good idea for me to be here. And then coming into FOSSA, they were the first people I interacted with who really believed me, and they didn't know me at all, but they were willing to take me in and mentor me. And this was before I had become student body president, before I had become political chair. I was just Danielle, just a freshman, and these people who knew nothing about me were willing to, get to know me, and not just get to know me, but also believe in me on a professional level. And people like Mark would tell me things like, hey, like, you could be like a Filipino American leader on this campus, like, you have what it takes. So that was really, really important to me, and that made a lot of difference, feeling like there were Filipino Americans here that I could, one, find friendship and community in, but two, people who also believed in me. So I ran for political chair, and I was elected, and that defined my sophomore year being a FOSSA officer. It was just a lot. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I didn't know that there were so many general meetings and events and just one thing after the other, weekly meetings, and it was just so stressful. But it taught me so much about the leadership skills that I have now, because I developed them as a FOSSA officer, all those skills in event planning and programming, and being political chair is also when I was able to apply the passion that I started getting about activism and politics and social justice. I founded Political Corner my sophomore year as political chair because I knew going into the role that I wanted FOSSA to be much more politically engaged. I didn't want, because prior to that, I think my freshman year there was just like one meeting a quarter when we talked about political chair things and politics related to Filipinos, and I wanted to integrate that into every single meeting. So I came to my office board and I said, hey, like, I have an idea, it's called Political Corner, and I want to integrate at least 5 to 10 minutes into every FOSSA general meeting and talk about an issue that's going on back home or here that relates to who we are as Filipino Americans and the injustices that we're facing in our identity. So I talked about a lot of different issues throughout that year, whether it be the racism that we face here, the colonialism we're still struggling with back home, imperialism, white supremacy, all those things I talked about. And I think slowly FOSA's climate became a lot more politically active and engaged, which I was really, really inspired by. And end of my sophomore year, I heard about PISU director, the Pacific Islander Student Commission with ASUW, which is student government on campus. There was an opening. They were hiring someone to be the director for next year. And I just applied on a whim, basically. I think there were a few people in my community who said, I think it would be a good idea if you did that. And again, it was just, I looked at them and I was like, what? Like, I could never see myself doing that. Like, I just don't think I have what it takes. But again, here were the people from FOSA constantly encouraging me and telling me, well, I think you should go for it. You can do it. So I applied and I was hired. And so that defined my junior year, being PISU director. And from that point, I think what got hard was I had to step away from FOSA a lot. My first 2 years were obviously it was all about FOSA, being a member, then being an officer, and then my junior year, now that FOSA was just one of 8 constituents that I had. I didn't want to, give any favor to FOSA because they were the organization that I came from. I wanted to be unbiased and professional in serving all of my 8 constituents from the Pacific Islander communities as best as I could. So I had to step away from FOSA a lot, but at the same time it was really interesting and inspiring to be able to get more involved with other groups like the Micronesian Islands Club, Polynesian Student Alliance, and that was my first role in student government, and it was just a lot for me because the first 2 years of FOSA was like my security blanket. FOSA was what got me through the 2 hardest years in college, that transition from Guam and the Philippines to the States. And now I just felt like I didn't have the time to go to general meetings anymore, and I didn't see everyone as much. And now I was working in student government in the hub. I was no longer at the ECC all the time. I was at the ASUW offices in the hub, and I felt like I was surrounded by white people all the time, and I wasn't surrounded by Filipinos as much, and it was just a lot for me because again I started experiencing like all these identity struggles and just feeling like I was constantly the only woman of color in the room, but at the same time that also sparked my fire for social justice and that passion that I had for activism even more. So I think it was winter quarter of my junior year when I came to my friend Erin, who was in Senate, and I asked her, because I noticed, in ASUW Senate they have protected seats for all the legacy groups. And I remember looking through the roster, and FOSA, Micronesian Islands Club, and Polynesian Student Alliance didn't have protected seats, and I just thought that was very peculiar because those are my 3 constituents as PISU director. So I asked her, like, hey, why don't my constituents have a protected seat in Senate? They're legacy groups, the other legacy groups have them, why don't we? And it just, that opened up like another can of worms, and it ended up being a huge fight that we did in Senate where we had to fight for those 3 protected seats and defend ourselves to a majority white male Senate and say, this is why we deserve protected seats, this is who legacy groups are, and this is what we've contributed to this campus. So that really got me going winter quarter, and I wanted to see it happen. I wanted to make sure that vote passed in the student body because it wasn't just because it was a constitutional change, it required a vote from the entire student body. It wasn't just from Senate. So we had to get a majority of this 45,000 student body to pass it, is what it felt like to me, and that was really scary. But I was very outspoken about it, and it got publicized by the Daily and the ASUW, so it was something that people knew was important and was happening, and I think we got a lot of the legacy groups who already had protected seats to band with us and rally, and that's ultimately how we won, is we were very outspoken, and we openly talked about why FOSA, MIC, and PSA were important to this campus and why they deserve protected seats. And a lot of it was linked to, fighting against racism and discrimination, but eventually we got it, which was amazing because it was like history was made, and that I felt really good about that because I felt like this was a way for me to give back to a community like FOSSA, MIC, and PSA that had given me so much, and that it was just right for us to have those protected seats. And it was also around that time when, as an employee in ACW, there's a lot of talk about like, oh, I wonder who's running for board of directors next year. You know, so last year's student body president, Tyler Wu, he messaged me and he said, hey, like, I heard you're interested in running for board. And I messaged him back and I was like, yeah, I'm interested, but at the same time it was something that I was joking about with my friends. I was like, oh yeah, like maybe I'd run for board. But deep down inside I knew if I were to run for board, I would only run for president, because that was the only position that I felt like I wanted to do. So when he messaged me, I said, yeah, but I like wasn't really taking it seriously. And he asked me, well, do you think you'd ever run for president? And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, like this is it. Like I've never really thought about this. Like what am I gonna say? But it was just like a very spur of the moment reaction. And I told him like, okay, like I'll think about it. And he was like, okay, like come over to my house tonight and we'll talk about it. So I went over to his live out of his frat, Pi Caps, and we ended up talking for like an hour. And in that hour, he got me hooked, and he was like, look, like, I believe in you. I think you can do this. I can't guarantee that you'll win, but you should do it. And in that moment, I just automatically said yes. I felt like this was something that I knew this was something that I wanted to do, and I knew that it was something worth doing, whether or not I won. So that turned into a completely different process with campaigning and running and all of that I won't go into, but it was a lot. It ended up being the most competitive ACW election cycle in history. And as a woman of color who was running for that role, it was the most challenging, stressful time of my life. I felt like I was constantly being scrutinized, constantly putting myself out there, which I wasn't used to, and putting my story out there, which I wasn't necessarily comfortable with because I didn't like being vulnerable in front of people, but I had to learn. And I also, you know, my time in FOSSA came to the spotlight, came to the forefront. People were asking, like, who's FOSSA? Like, where are you from? Because, like, a majority of people who run for student body president are, you know, white people who are Greek or involved in, you know, other communities. And there had never in recent years, or maybe even ever, been a student body president from a legacy group. So there was a lot of, I think, buzz around that, and people telling me things like, you know, you're a diversity commission director, like you don't know anything, like you don't have what it takes to be on the board of directors, like, and there was no Filipino or Pacific Islander who had ever been student body president. They didn't even know we existed. So it was just a lot running for that, and I put everything at stake when I put myself out there. But I think in those times, FOSSA, again, like, did not let me down. A lot of them volunteered for me. They supported me at my presidential debate, at my forums, and it was just, I felt like this was my next chapter, was I wanted to give back to UW in this way. And I ended up winning, and it was just, when I won, it was like a whirlwind. I felt like in that moment when they announced my name that my entire life stopped, and I just couldn't think, and I started sobbing. Because I had given so much to that campaign. I had put so much time and resources and effort on the line. And when I won, it felt like I didn't even know what to think, you know? And then when I won, I got elected my senior year. I came into it knowing that there was so much at stake because I was the first Filipino in this role. I was, you know, the first Pacific Islander, first person in a while who was not even from Washington. There were just so many firsts that I was grappling with, and I knew that whatever I was going to do, I was going to make history. Whether or not it was good or bad would be up to me. And I had no idea that I was going to go into a year and Trump was going to be elected, or, you know, Milo was going to come to campus. All these things just ended up happening, and it was really, really hard for me. And I had to step away from FOSSA even more, because now I had to serve 45,000 people, and I just didn't have the time to just focus on FOSSA anymore. And I think that was really isolating at first, but in those moments constantly where I was the only woman of color in the room, I was the only student in the room, FOSSA was what got me through that, like remembering this by numbers, this small community on campus on the other side at the ECC, and I was over here at the Hub or in Gerberding advocating for students. I would remember FOSSA and how much they had given me, and that would motivate me. And I'd tell myself, like, there are a lot of people who are counting on you, they've invested in you, they believe in you, you need to do well. And it also got me through times of stress and questioning my identity. I remembered what I had learned in FOSA, what I'd done as political chair. So all those things got me through the presidency. And just this past year has made me so self-aware and confident in who I am as a Filipino American and as a Filipina, because I'm constantly being put in spaces where I'm the only woman of color, I'm the only student. And there's just been so many challenging parts to the job. Being in FOSA and having that community around me is what got me through it. And I think that's why FOSA changed my life, and why I will always give back to it, is because, again, they took me in when I was a freshman. I didn't know anything before I was president. And even when I come back to spaces in FOSA, people don't look at me as like, oh, like there's Danielle, the ASUW president, like what everyone else does, which is valid because it's part of the job. But at the same time, what I appreciate about FOSA is I go back into that space and they just see me as Danielle. They see me as the freshman from Guam that they knew 3 years ago. And that's always really important to me, because FOSA keeps me grounded. Because I remember when I came to the States for the first time and I had nothing and I knew no one, and they were the ones who were there for me. That Filipino-American community has changed my life and has really helped me come to terms with my identity. And I know that moving forward, like after graduation, I'll be moving to New York to work at a law firm. It's like a 1 to 2 year rotational business program that I'll do before I go to law school or something. I don't know what's in the future, what lies ahead, but I know that whatever happens to me, FOSA will always be there for me. In whichever city I go to, I will find the Filipino-American community there and get involved and get integrated, because my people and my culture is what, at the end of the day, motivates me more than anything else. So, there you go.